Alright, so if you are completely new to Phoenix, I'm going to give you an introduction to the plugin to get you up to speed. If you are more advanced, feel free to just skip this lesson. So after you install Phoenix, you're gonna get this Phoenix FD toolbar. There are a lot of handy shortcuts and some presets that we're gonna go over in the next lesson. So I'm gonna hit Alt W to maximize this window, and basically to tell 3ds Max that you want to be running a simulation with Phoenix, you need to create a Phoenix FD grid. So I'm gonna go under create geometry, and then usually it says standard, but you can go under Phoenix FD and create a fire and smoke sim. And you can click auto grid and just drag out a Phoenix grid just like this. So throughout this course, we're only gonna be using the fire and smoke sim. If you've taken any of my ocean or liquid courses, that's where we covered the foam, the liquid simulation, and the active bodies as well. So the important thing about this grid is do not hit R for scale and try and scale this. That will completely destroy your simulation. The only way you should ever change the size of the grid is under the modify tab, grid, and then you can drag these sliders on the different axes to modify the size. So we do have a grid, but even if I start the simulation, nothing will happen because there's no source for the fire. So first we need to create some kind of an object to emit the fire out of. So I'm just gonna create a sphere. And now we need to tell Phoenix that we want to emit fire and smoke out of this sphere. And for that, I'm gonna go under helpers, Phoenix FD, and create a PHX source, the one with the fire logo, and click add and add the sphere as our source. So now if I hit start simulation, you're gonna see that we're gonna get some very basic default simulation of fire that generates smoke, just like this. So it's kind of difficult to see right now, so I'm gonna go under the settings for the grid, under preview, and you can enable the GPU preview just to make this look much better. And this will be our starting point. So as you guys can see, I really like using the toolbar here for the quick actions to start the simulation, pause, stop, and then you can also hit this trash can to delete the cache. So I'm gonna do that right now. Select the sim box, hit the trash can, and the cache will effectively be deleted. I can go under grid and lower the resolution a little bit just to make the simulation run faster. And I'm gonna hit start simulation again. And as the simulation is running, I can hit pause to pause it, right? And then I can hit pause again to continue from where I left off. Now, if I hit stop simulation, and then I want to start the simulation again, it'll actually start from frame 0 if I hit start right now. You see it will reset. So the only way to continue a simulation after you've stopped it, so let's do it right now, let's hit stop, is to go under simulation and hit restore. So I'm gonna hit restore, and you can see that it went 2 frames backwards because that's where the restore point was created. And I'll continue the simulation from there. So let me do it again. Stop simulation and restore. It went back to frame 16 and it continues from there. Now you can control how often it'll create these backup points. If you go under output, and here you have the backup interval. So right now the backup interval is 15. That's why when we were on frame 19, it went back to frame 16. Right? Because that's where the restore point was. But I can set the backup interval to maybe 5. So every 5 frames, I will be able to restore the simulation if I need to. So looking at this toolbar, this whole section here, these are just the presets that we're gonna go over a little bit in the next lesson. Then you have access to the Phoenix FD help file here. And then you have some shortcuts to the most common actions. So you can click this one here to create the grid like we did. And then you can click here to create the Phoenix source like we just did. And then you have some more settings. Here's the particle shader. This is used to render foam for liquid simulations. You have the active bodies helper that's also for liquid sims. You have the Phoenix FD mapper, which can be used for something like a lava simulation and making it harden over time. And you also have a plane force. So plane force is something that can be used to push the smoke to the side. So if I just put it over here, let me delete all of these, and you can go under the plane force and just maybe set the strength to something extreme like 100. And I'm gonna start the simulation just to show you how that works. So you can see that now basically it acts like a very strong wind. It's just pushing the fire to the side. So this actually looks pretty cool. You could use this for something like a jet engine fire, like a plane crash or a meteor or something like that. All right, so the simulation tab, we covered start, stop, simulation, restore. Then you can control where you want to start and stop the simulation. So by default, it's controlled by the timeline, but you can uncheck this and set this to 10. So now if I start the simulation, it'll start on frame 10, and you can do the same thing for the end as well. Here you have some useful information about how long everything is taking. So you're gonna spend a lot of time here looking at, okay, it took maybe 10 seconds to render one frame. So I know that it's gonna take maybe 2 hours before the whole sequence is finished. It's gonna give you an estimated time left. The resimulation tab is used for wavelet turbulence mainly, and then some slow motion effects. We're gonna cover that later on. So the scene scale I will usually leave at default, which is 1. And instead, we're going to go under Customize Unit Setup. And this is where we're going to control the scale for our scenes. So for something like a big aircraft carrier fire, you might work in 1 unit is 1 meter. For something like a car, you might work in 1 unit is 1 centimeter. I'm always going to touch on the importance of scale as we work, because if your scale is wrong, your simulation will never look right and it'll be hard for you to follow the course. So that's something we're gonna cover. So one of the most important settings that you will constantly change is the cell size. This is how you control the resolution of your simulation. So the cell is basically just another word for a voxel. And a voxel is basically just a 3-dimensional pixel. So right now you're looking at a monitor that's maybe 1920 by 1080 pixels making up your screen. The resolution for the grid is also made out of pixels, except they're 3-dimensional. So they're basically these cubes or voxels. So I'm just gonna make a box, and this box basically is one cell. And the more of these cells I can fit into the grid, the higher the resolution is, right? So they go in all directions like this. So now if I want to raise the resolution, I need to be able to fit more of these voxels into the grid. So I would go under cell size and maybe lower this to something like 0.6, let's say. So now you can see that the size of the voxels is much smaller. We went from a big box to something that's maybe only this small. So now I can fit a lot more of these into the grid, therefore the resolution of the simulation is much higher. So it's a bit counterintuitive. Basically, to raise the resolution, you need to lower the cell size, or you can just click increase resolution a few times or decrease. This is just a shortcut to do the same thing, but I prefer to do it manually just to have more control. And I can see as I drag how many total cells I have. So whenever we run simulations, usually I will just start at a low res sim, so maybe something like 2.5 million cells to start, just something lower res to see what's happening. And then as we finish the effect and we want to get more resolution, we will lower the cell size and therefore increase the amount of total cells to get some much nicer detail. Next up are the container walls. So basically right now, if the fire reaches the edge of the simulator, let me run the simulation, the fire will instantly be killed. So you can see the fire is rising, 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 and when it reaches the edge, it's just instantly killed when it comes in contact with the border. Now I can stop that from happening by going under Z and say jammed plus. And you can always tell which wall is which by these arrows. So Z arrow up means that this wall up here is Z plus and down is Z minus. Same here, X this way, so this would be X plus and this would be X minus. And same with Y, arrow is pointing this way, so this is Y plus and this wall is Y minus. So I'm jamming the wall on Z plus, which is basically the ceiling. So if I go under simulation and restore, you can see that going forward, the smoke is hitting the wall and it's continuing to spread to the sides. But as soon as it reaches this wall or this wall, it'll be killed again because these walls are still open. So I'm gonna actually say jam both, and jam both on Z as well. So now I'm basically filling this cube up with smoke, and the smoke cannot escape. It's going to continue living forever basically, or until it dissipates. Next up, we have the adaptive grid. So right now you can see that we're simulating a lot of empty space. You know, you may think that we're simulating just the fire and smoke, but in reality, we are simulating every single cell inside of this grid, and there's a lot of dead empty space that we're simulating for nothing. So in a real scenario, what you would do is actually just shrink the grid to fit your object as tightly as possible. So maybe, you know, something like that. Lower the Z, and you can always just delete the cache if it's just confusing you. So we can do something like that. Set the adaptive grid as enabled by, let's say, temperature. And you can also do enable by smoke, but since we do have fire, the fire is emitting temperature. So basically gonna say the threshold should be 500. So if the temperature at any point is higher than 500 anywhere near the border of the grid will automatically expand to cover the simulation. So let me just run it to show you how that works. And it's not working because I forgot to uncheck jammed both. So adaptive grid will not work if the walls are jammed. So I'm gonna set them to open again and restart the sim. And now you can see that the grid is beautifully expanding on all axes to cover the simulation. Now, sometimes this doesn't work as well. Some of the smoke may still get clipped on the edges, especially like over here. You know, if you were to render this out right now, you may see that there's actually a bit of the smoke still cut off. To prevent that from happening, you can set the extra margin to something like 5, and it'll give you an additional margin around the sim box to cover any potential problems like this. So if I run the simulation again, you're gonna see that the box expands further out to make sure that the simulation is completely contained. You see we're getting much larger gap here between the smoke and the grid. So this is working beautifully. The only issue you're gonna run into is that the grid is going to keep expanding forever. There's no limit. And so by the time I get to frame 200, let's say, the grid will be huge and the simulation is going to start taking forever to sim because we have such a giant grid. Now, you really only want to simulate what you need. So let's just say that this is my camera view. This is all I care about, and I don't really need the grid to be expanding all the way up here. So for that, we have the maximum expansion. So I'm gonna say that I only wanted to expand on Z maybe this high up. I don't really need it to go underground, so I'm just gonna make that 0. And then on the Y and X axis, I'm just gonna shrink it on all sides because I don't really expect the smoke to be expanding to the sides that much, right? So maybe I'm gonna do something like this, and let's run the simulation maybe from here just to show you how that works. So I'm gonna hit stop and restore. So now as you can see, the grid is expanding, but as soon as it reaches the red maximum expansion box, it is stopped, and the smoke will be killed as soon as it reaches the red border. So this is a great way for you to control what happens and really conserve your resources. So you know that you're only simulating what you need, but then you can also control when it's supposed to stop expanding. Next up, we have the dynamics tab. We're gonna spend a lot of time here. Basically, we have some settings for time scale, for slow motion. We have some smoke dissipation, smoke buoyancy we're gonna use for the heavy smoke. So basically, if you were to make this something like -1, the smoke would be heavy and not rise as fast or even sort of fall down. You have some controls for gravity, vorticity controls, basically the swirls in the smoke. We're gonna go over all of that. Steps per frame, very important. We're gonna cover basically whenever there's a fast object moving through the smoke, you wanna make this at least 2, but we're gonna go maybe as high as 4. Then fuel, basically there are 2 main ways to create a fire effects with Phoenix. You can either burn fuel, and as the fuel burns, it'll create smoke, or you can just render temperature as fire. So right now, there is no fuel. We only have hot temperature, and the hotter the temperature is, the whiter it is. The lower the temperature, the more orange. And then the lowest temperatures are not even rendered, and we only get the smoke. So again, we're gonna cover all of that in more detail. I'm just giving you some general overview of these tabs. Scene interaction, very important. Let's say that you're working on a tornado, and so you would usually have something like a vortex, and the vortex is controlling maybe your Typhlow particles. However, by default, this vortex will also automatically influence all of your smoke and fire as well. So if you want to exclude anything from influencing the simulation, you can just click add and make sure that it's excluded, and then it will not affect the simulation at all. Under output, you're gonna just choose the path where you wanna save the simulation cache files. As always, I recommend that this is an SSD drive because these files can get huge, and saving them on a fast drive will save you minutes and eventually hours of time. You always want to output velocity for motion blur, and then later on when we do the explosion where the different colors of smoke are mixing, we're going to also output RGB, and for any wavelet turbulence effects, you're going to also output wavelet. So an important tab for sure here. Input, this is used for mainly the slow motion and slowing things down. Under preview, we're gonna spend some time here, mainly just enabling the GPU preview. You can also exclude lights from influencing the GPU preview. So if you have like a bright light, the smoke could just be pure white. So you can just exclude that light here from this list. Rendering tab, we're gonna spend a lot of time here. You can adjust these settings to make the rendering much faster. And then of course, volumetric options is pretty much the heart of this course. This is where we're gonna be controlling the shaders for everything, the brightness of the fire, the color of the fire. The smoke opacity is controlled from here, just like this, and also the smoke color. And you can also control some fun effects, such as shading the smoke based on its speed. So here under smoke color, you can select speed. And if you go under output and you output the speed grid channel, then you can basically give the smoke a different color the faster it moves and stuff like that. So definitely a very powerful tool here to control how your fire and smoke are rendered and how they look. We're gonna spend a lot of time playing with these curves, explaining all of these opacity modes and all that. So this is just a very basic overview of how this plugin works. Definitely, if you're completely new, drop in a sphere and run a basic sim to see how everything is working. Most importantly, just to recap, you're always gonna need a grid. Then you're always gonna need some kind of a source, which in our case would be the sphere. And then you need to create a source and make the sphere a source. And that's pretty much all you need. So if you are completely new and you're still confused, don't worry. We're gonna go over all of these steps over and over again in this course. So just, go to the next lesson and I'll see you there.